So definitely thank you for the introduction. Welcome everyone all around. Definitely encourage questions as we proceed by all means, and Emma will help me in addressing some of those questions and pulling them in as we go. You definitely have the title, and thank you again for the introduction. There's a few things I do want to highlight relative to the introduction and offer a little bit of background because it does give context to the rest of the conversation here today. In particular, my focus has always been really transformation and working with the diversity of organizations and people and teams. I've really helped focus on, in particular, the operating models and the business models that organizations use, bring them into calibration, for lack of better words, and then really help them have an impact in the world at large. Numerous case studies as well that you can reference out there. In particular, here's ways to reach out to me. You've got my email, you've got my LinkedIn. I definitely want to emphasize a couple of books that we are dipping into. One of them is Conscious Agility with Brad Barton and Mark Ferraro, two dear colleagues. So their influence on this work is very significant all around. And then the Anti-Fragility Edge in 2016. Let me say a little bit more about kind of my approach to things and how I've worked with individuals and organizations. We hear the word catalyst or alchemist in many ways. I really focus on sort of three things that I like to call the sacred triad, and these then manifest in practice. And the sacred triad is made up of these particular three things and how they intersect. And one of them is reality, how we deal with reality. What I found is a lot of organizations struggle in dealing with reality. We deal with what we think reality is versus the reality itself that's out there. A lot of difficult conversations can't be had because people don't deal with reality. The other thing that is key to the sacred triad is human nature. People aren't good or bad. People are a mix of all of that. So that's another aspect that a lot of teams, individuals, and organizations really struggle with. And the last aspect is identity of who we are, what we can become, etc. Now, these may seem like very esoteric concepts, but they're crucial to how we bring them together, how we achieve a degree of aliveness and have an impact in the world. So you're going to hear a lot of that underlying tone as we proceed. Let me go one step further and really organize the 40 plus years, almost 50 years now, actually, of work that I've done, because it will give significance again to what you're going to be seeing today. The first 20 years, the 1980s and the 1990s, spent a lot of time, if you will, really in practice. And as I like to say, we really were dealing with complexity in practice, helping organizations apply complexity to have impact. There's significance to that because that period of time, there's a lot of learnings, a lot of discovery of what can happen. We were using complexity before it became popular, quite honestly. We were calling ourselves catalysts before. Nowadays, it's much more popular. We were using triads. Nowadays, you hear trios is another key terminology. And applying the concepts of agility, resilience, and anti-fragility before they had a lot of formality in, I'll say, the modern space that we see today. In the 2000s, we started to refine and hone in our work and began to share. We started writing and publishing around 2005, and then really began to publicize, if you will, the case studies and the experience that we had. In 2010, two major case studies came out, and so you have a period of exploration, formalization, then really beginning to share. 2010, we were talking about agility health. We were talking about hygiene. We were talking about maturity models, again, at the tip of these things becoming popular. And then in 2013, the first book came out. And in 2016, the second book came out that began to tie the threads. And we continue to evolve these concepts. Now, I say all this because in 2019, with COVID hitting the world, we saw a little bit of resurgence of these concepts. And as such, there's a lot of information out there. What I'm going to be sharing with you is all rooted in pragmatism. It's all rooted in practice. And as we like to say, it's practice-informed theory and theory-driven practice. The significant pieces that we have learned have come out of practice, to be very, very blunt about it. All of this is derived from practice. It has demonstrated tremendous success, but a lot of it may sound unconventional to you as you approach it, counterintuitive, if you will, and unorthodox, as we talk about, especially about teams. So it will challenge us in so many different ways. Saying all of that, before we dive in deeper, just a few more things. I'll use a lot of different words. The language may not be directly connected to the words that you use. For example, I'll use intention as a keyword. You may use the word purpose or cause or vision. Though the language itself is very messy. I'll use the word tension, paradoxes, friction. These are other similar synonyms. Adversity or anxiety or trauma. Those are very, very connected. And then I'll reference performance. This is advantage. So the language itself, please keep in mind, is very fluid as we encounter it in this conversation. As you encounter the breadth and depth of things that we're going to be exploring, there's a lot of conversations out there in the space. Some of them are a lot more shallow and narrow versus what we've gone after in terms of depth and really bringing things from a practical perspective. In particular, there's a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of hype out there. There's a lot of speculation, conjecture that's out there. People have repackaged practices, but I really want to emphasize that what is out there, and you want to ask yourself, what's the underlying model or framework and how do we operationalize it? That's the core of a lot of what we're going to be sharing. If I summarize all of it, it's really about having skin in the game to learn together and move forward. So this is across communities, from the agile space, the complexity space, the resilience, the continuity space, the crisis management space, but there's a lot for us to dive into. And we're very fortunate, I'm very fortunate to Comparative Agility for helping to continue to advance the work. So I can't thank you enough for all the team and Amra and Jorgen and everyone that's been involved in all this. So with that backdrop, as a little bit long-winded, but very significant, if we now dive in and think about the experiences that we've gone through, one of the key things that really hit us pretty hard is that reality is very, very wild, as we can say. And we have become too tame as individuals and as teams and as organizations. We can't domesticate reality. It is what it is. So we have to rewild ourselves. In saying all of that, we have to reconceptualize what is really our experience of the world. And in that experience, how do we think about order and disorder? How do we think about risk, for example, change and disruption? These are very, very key words that we use almost without thought nowadays. How do we think about systems thinking? How do we approach systems thinking and paradoxical thinking and complexity thinking? So all of these concepts now really begin to intersect for us. As such, what I've essentially been working on for all these years with my colleagues, with clients, and with numerous practitioners out there is the whole idea of, if you will, really the edge. And the edge is fundamentally bringing in, as we've already mentioned, agility, resilience, and anti-fragility for individuals, teams, organizations, or enterprises and ecosystems. This is the place, I'll say, where all these things intersect and we really begin to harness the paradoxical nature of the reality and really begin to flourish in this set of entanglements that we have. The best way to really be sort of introduced to these concepts is to reflect on the past few years. And let's just reflect on our experience and see what we begin to call out. If you look at from the 2019 COVID experience, a lot happened and we all experienced that period differently. Let me share a little bit of the story and see how these concepts now begin to emerge for us. As COVID hit, especially here in the States in particular, I started to get a lot of phone calls. And the big message that a lot of organizations will reach out with is, we can't make sense of anything. We have no idea what's happening. We can't make decisions. All of our plans have gone out the window. We just don't know what to do. All the way from our partners, our customers, to our employees. Everything that we thought we understood, we no longer really understand. How do we deal with all that? So immediately my suggestion was, let's go ahead and just simply grab your leadership team in particular together, and let's just begin to have a few conversations. The first conversation is I said, look, help me understand, what are you experiencing? As people began to share about what they were experiencing relative to their customers, relative to the dynamics, very quickly, they began to recognize that there's volatility that they're experiencing. Likewise, elements of stability. There were key players on their teams that they called out, but there's volatility that they were experiencing, ambiguity of indecision that could no longer be made or had been made and were now called in question. They didn't understand how things were related. But very quickly, those conversations began to focus around what we now commonly call VUCA, if you will: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And then also, there are counter pieces to it. Yes, we had strong players. That provides a degree of stability for us to work with. I said, excellent. Now that we're beginning to understand our experience and what's going on, and it doesn't mean we have all the depth of it, but just enough to begin to engage it. I said, let's go ahead and talk about ourselves. What can we do here? What can't we do here? And people began to recognize, well, you know something, we've got a strong partner set of relationships out there, so we can lean on our partners. Excellent. Those are some of the strengths that we want to leverage. You know something, we're not used to operating in a distributed environment where people now were staying at home. Well, okay, that's a challenge and a weakness that we want to begin to recognize. How about our competitors? Are there any particular threats that we have to keep in mind? Most people were interested in survival at that point. So really now beginning to think about the second set of conversations that began to unfold. And these happened very, very quickly. They were truly focused on our opportunities, threats, strengths, and weaknesses, or if you will, SWOT. This is not your traditional SWOT analysis, but a set of conversations that we began to recognize that were happening in our world and reality. I said, okay, now that we have our sort of perspective, let's go ahead now and think about what can we do at this point and how do we get it done? Here, the conversation now shifted into really what decisions we need to immediately make, what decisions don't we need to immediately make, and how do we enact those decisions? This really brought in one last pattern, and this is really the OODA pattern that we're going to dive even deeper into. So as this began to unfold and these conversations happened, and the first set of conversations happened literally within an hour across all of this. And we said, okay, we need to make some things happen. Let's go ahead and make those things happen. Let's go ahead and touch base every day to have a reflection on these and continue to begin to navigate the world around us. Very, very quickly, at that point, we began to reach out to other teams in the organization, began to work with these concepts, and really began to move forward. What came out of this experience are a few very, very key things as we reflect. How do we make sense of the world? How do we really go ahead and make decisions and take action at scale? And how widespread did it become? The conversations that I just mentioned became natural. They were catered. If there was more turbulence, if you will, in the environment, more challenges that we encountered, we had them regularly, sometimes daily, sometimes multiple times a day. And then where there was more stability, for example, we had them every other day, etc. We also expanded our efforts so the organizations that I was working with and the teams that I was working with began to be able to better navigate. This really gives us a sense of how to work with order and disorder. And if you look at both of those, order and disorder, those are what reality is all about. They can be both extreme, if you will, and we have to navigate them. And the way to navigate them and really focus on them is to move toward what I like to call the in-between. This has historically been called the edge of chaos as well. That set of recognitions now began to help us understand how we can really begin to thrive and deal with the paradoxes that we have. As people reflected on that experience, as I reflected on the experience, and really, this is not something that emerged in 2019, but rather was tapped into in 2019. But again, from all the history, this is the nature of the work that we've been involved with. So saying all of that, all of these concepts have one root source, and that's nature. And if we think about how does nature operate, it really is in the form of an ecology, as we are describing all the elements of it. Saying all of this, if you've essentially followed all along at this stage of the game, you've got all the fundamentals for all the concepts that I'm going to be talking about. We've touched them in one form or another. What I'm going to do is I'm going to dive into the three core concepts of agility, resilience, and anti-fragility. Then we'll talk about them from a change and disruption perspective, a stress perspective, and then we'll get into ecosystem thinking and how that really is applied in business and how you can tap into it, very much tapping into and leveraging what comparative agility and the work that we've been doing brings to the table. A few reflections before we dive in even deeper. If you think about reality, it's a collection of tensions. It's on that spectrum between order and disorder. If you approach it as a collection of tensions, don't think about managing or controlling those tensions. Think about really acknowledging them, engaging, and working with the tensions. But that's really what reality is, a collection of tensions. Additionally, we think about how we experience those tensions. That's what we commonly call as stress. When you experience a set of tensions, that's what the pressure is coming in from. You experience it as stress. It causes us to struggle. We're basically we become aroused in terms of our performance, and then we navigate through it. Some stress can be very beneficial. This is commonly called eustress. Some stress can be very, very dangerous. This is when it becomes distress. So when we are aroused, we can achieve high performance. We can go ahead and be very successful in navigating the world around us. When it becomes too much, it begins to break down. It begins to work against us. This is very, very key for thinking about stress, really is the way that we experience tensions in the world. The key thing for us is how do we now work with stress to maximize our eustress, the positive stress, minimize the distress, and begin to leverage and navigate the world to whatever we want to accomplish and achieve. As such, there's two phrases that I always encourage folks to keep in mind. When we encounter reality, don't fall into a vicious reality control cycle. Don't build the mindset that the more I can control, the more I can really be successful. Because we have very little control as we dig into the world around us, truly. And we experienced that in 2019. But rather acknowledge reality, engage it, and work with it, and then leverage it. This is a shift, liberating ourselves from a vicious reality control cycle to what I like to call and embracing the virtuous reality identity cycle. It's very, very powerful. And as we work together, we're on the spectrum of the in-between. Some people prefer more order. Other people prefer more disorder. I can tell you when COVID hit, there were numerous people that I had worked with that were always used to traveling. They preferred a degree of disorder. Then they became locked up at home. They couldn't do anything. They truly, truly struggled with all of that. This is the backdrop for what we are diving into. Let's go ahead and look at these three key concepts: agility, resilience, and anti-fragility. Well, the way I want you to think about these really is, if we're going to talk about stress, we're going to talk about reality as a collection of tensions. These three elements are really muscle fibers. These muscle fibers come together to create a complexity muscle. That complexity muscle, if you will, is what allows us to really work with reality. In particular, as muscles, these are properties just of a human being, of a team, etc. They're not absolute by any stretch, but rather they're degrees on a spectrum. You can be stronger or weaker in that sense. And in that, if you will, they're always relative to a given situation. You can be very strong relative to what you do in one context, very weak in another. Very much in that contextual implementation of how we experience these things. Additionally, there's always a source of stress that we encounter. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the source of stress? What's the range of exposure? For example, I can handle very high temperatures where a lot of people can't handle very high temperatures. A lot of people can handle also all sorts of stress and remain calm in other situations. Likewise, others cannot. So we need to think about the occurrence, the exposure, the acuteness, the chronicness of that stress, and at what the recovery time. A lot of facets that I'm really just touching on just so we can wrap our heads around these things. So if you think about now agility, resilience, and anti-fragility, the real focus here of agility is responsiveness. Likewise, for resilience, it's the ability to recover. And then for anti-fragility, it really is about growth. And if you think about those key words now, and as I mentioned, the world around us, diving into the details, Really, agility is rooted in change and how we are reactively, if you will, embracing change, really adapting in that context via that stress that comes in. On the anti-fragility side, it's very, very different here. Here now we're looking at disorder and disruption, and now we're proactively seeking, because we want to grow, we're proactively seeking that stress so we can evolve, and that's coming in from disorder side. And then really resilience is there in between both of them that allows us to recover and continue. Here now we're reactively addressing the impact of that stress that's coming in from both order and disorder. Now you may say, Si, I'm not really thinking about how do we proactively seek stress? And I'll give you a few examples that are very, very key. If you think about immunization and vaccines that we take, whether it's the cold or a flu vaccine or other types of vaccines, we actually are looking, if you will, to stress our systems by injecting the virus into our systems so our system can better learn to fight that virus. That is essentially going ahead and proactively seeking and stressing our system in order to grow. That's the way that our system evolves. Let me give you one more example. A lot of us do exercise and go to the gym or what have you. Well, as we've been talking about muscles, essentially by going to the gym or exercising, you're actively stressing yourself in order, if you will, to evolve and grow those muscles so that we can better handle stronger stresses. That's very much rooted in anti-fragility. Now, notice it's very, very proactive. It's not reactive. I encounter a lot of people say, you know, something, I've experienced stress and I've grown from it. Very much so. That is very much reactive. It's not necessarily anti-fragility. It's actually more resilience and growth, and likewise an element of agility and growth. But with anti-fragility, it is proactively seeking stress. One more example, post-traumatic growth, if you will. Post-traumatic growth is another key concept. Here, do we seek, if you will, stress, or don't we seek stress? If we're passively anti-fragile in this case, yes, we go through a traumatic experience perhaps, and we grow from it. But did we seek that trauma? No, we didn't seek that trauma. So in that context, it isn't, if you will, anti-fragility. These are very, very, again, crucial to these distinctions in the space of what we call the in-between or the edge. So as we operate in the world, we don't want to go to an extreme of looking for order because it'll make us fragile and it can really be disruptive for us. We don't want to go to complete disorder because it turns into chaos, but rather we have to operate in the in-between, in that edge space, very, very crucially. Now, saying all that, so how do we get to the in-between? Well, the way is to explore, to discover what will move us toward the in-between. In particular, as we have different experiences, we do simulations, for example, what will move us and what will help build these muscles to get us toward the in-between. So as you have these experiences of working with organizations, working with teams, working with different teams, those are very, very key to move toward the in-between. In saying all that, I want to talk about two other sort of very, very quickly sort of big picture views, and then get very specific around how these concepts are applied in organizations. The first view that I'm going to mention here is thinking about order and disorder from change and disruption. Again, just how all the pieces tie. As you look at here, we think about change as coming in from the order side. This is really what agility is all about. Are we adapting or are we not adapting? Are we open to that adapt to change or not open to change? This is where we hone in on agility. On the disorder side, this is where disruption again comes in. And another way to view it is now, basically, are we anti-fragile? Are we gaining? Are we, if you will, wanting disorder and then be able to gain from it and grow? Or are we on the fragility side? Are we harmed by it? And again, here now, what we're doing is we suffer. So we don't want it. We don't want disorder, but we want order at that point. The key phrases is, at best, if you will, we're unharmed on the fragile side when we encounter disorder, at best. But if you will, on the anti-fragility side, at worst, we're unharmed. So we do want that degree of stress to help us proactively grow. This is one view of it. And again, there's a lot more here, which I'm not going to dive into on this slide. And you can reference a lot of my content that gets a lot deeper, likewise, into some of these particular slides. I want to give one more view so how we see all this ties together even further. Again, thinking about order and disorder and thinking about stress in particular, we all have affinities, and that's very natural. If we look at order, there's less randomness here. It's more non-random. A lot of perhaps risk aversion is a key word. When we think about what's normal, we think about preserving equilibrium. We really are seeking stability. Well, we got to push ourselves. When we begin to push ourselves, we begin to encounter stress. We essentially begin to move from a surviving perspective to a thriving perspective, and then we get into the agility space. If we push ourselves too far, it becomes distress. And here now, if we push ourselves much too far, it becomes catastrophic, and that becomes dangerous. So that's one side of the equation. On the other side of the equation, again, we're regularly dealing with randomness or irregularity. We essentially, for us, normal at that point becomes preserving a degree of turbulence. Maybe we take too many risks in this case. We're risk inclined, as we commonly say. Here again, now we apply stress to actually reduce the degree of risk inclination. Here we're proactive in seeking stress, but moving us toward the in-between, and we become risk aware. This is the power of this middle section. If now we become too stable, then now it becomes disastrous for us. And too much stability can bring us to the order side, in which case we suffer and we die out. The real key thing here is staying in the middle, again, the in-between. If we look at resilience, as I've mentioned, from both sides, really being able to reactively address the impact of stress. So if there's anything you take away from this picture as we look at stress and how it ties everything together, we really need to become risk aware, risk savvy, if you will, is another keyword, balancing risk taking in our risk inclination, as well as risk aversion in our risk management. All of those begin to balance out. Now, saying all of that, again, there's a lot more that we can dive into. Now let's go ahead and really kind of bring it into the business context for ourselves. If we think about business, and I'll share numerous stories now and across these slides of how these things are leveraged. If we think about business definitively, we all have organizations that are made of individuals. Those individuals begin to form teams in different ways. There can be product teams, project teams, functional teams, departmental teams, all sorts of teams that we talk about. They begin to form an organization. And likewise, we operate in different industries. Very, very much a traditional sense in all the facets that come into play to that. If you think of all that now, what we need to do is zoom out a little bit and think about the whole notion of ecosystems as I've already mentioned it, if you will, with all the concepts that we've brought in. And when we think about ecosystems, this is the way that nature, again, deals with everything that we encounter and experience. For nature, it's about ecology. So now when we think about ecology, what does that really mean, if you will? When we think about ecology and the way that nature is able to really keep things, I'll say, stable and on the order side, and also growing and evolving from the disorder side, really in the in-between at the edge of chaos, then really nature has a number of concepts that it works with. In my experience, what we've derived in ecosystem thinking are really a worldview that is composed of a few pillars, few core concepts, and likewise some foundational principles that we implement in organizations for the specific practices. So notice, I'm not saying here, I'm going to give you a set of practices, go do them. Rather, what I'm saying here is this is the way to think about things in order to get the practices that will benefit you in your context, very, very much in particular. So let me dive in to a few of these, and then we'll see how they quickly begin to apply to our previous slide and then change the worldview for us at that point. So in terms of the pillars, when you think about ecosystems, think about really a collection of stakeholders, a collection of players, a collection of participants that are in continuous reconfiguration. That's very, very crucial. That's what we need to do is when we think about ecosystems. Additionally, when you think about an enterprise, those enterprises are really those collections of stakeholders that are very, very dynamic, that continuous reconfiguration, And likewise, that makes them very much dynamic in how they deal with and experience reality. The core concepts now that begin to manifest themselves are going ahead and tied to numerous principles. So the three principles that we're really dealing with are entrepreneurship, explorership, and the experience aspect of it. When you think about entrepreneurship, if you're an entrepreneur, you're always asking yourself, what are my options? That's really what we were doing when a crisis hit. What are our options? How do we perform experiments to refine those options? This is very, very crucial for us as we achieve a degree of congruence, as we like to say, in order to move forward together. What are my options? What are our options? How do we perform experiments? How are we congruent in order to be able to have the impact in the world that we want to have? That's really operating as entrepreneurs. Well, if we're just doing all sorts of options and experimenting all around, doesn't mean we're going to have anything that's going to give us a degree of order or stability. We can achieve complete disorder at that point. So on the counter side, we need to be explorers as well. We have to have a sense of independence, but at the same time, a sense of redundance. In saying all of that, then this allows us to establish better connections with one another. So yes, I'm independent of Amra, for example. She's independent of me, but you know something, there's a degree of redundancy between us that allows us to operate together. That is the explorership side of the house. This is order and disorder coming in. You literally see the tension as I just mentioned it. Now, how we experience reality, and this becomes the crucial centerpiece of it. As individuals, we can be very fluid across our space. We can flow together, as we like to say. And these are very, very key words in the agile space and the lean space. And then as we form larger units, as teams and enterprises, we have to be able to flex or flux within the context of the broader environment. So our thinking is really now moving us from simply trying to control or manage, but truly navigate the world around us. How do we synchronize? And that dynamic nature really begins to manifest. There is a lot more to this, if you will, picture and ecosystem thinking. But then the real question is now, okay, we kind of see this, we get a gist of it. Well, how does it manifest in the world around us? And what does it really mean for our traditional worldview? So now saying all this, and I'm applying it to organizations, but you can apply it to architecture, which we've done, to really social environments, countries, economies, etc. Numerous ways to apply ecosystem thinking. But now if we take this view becomes a little bit different as we now begin to imbue it with ecosystem thinking. Let me talk through this and give some very, very specific, if you will, examples. We take that dynamic nature. We really begin to no longer think about industries and how we're creating values and competitive advantage, but we think about transient advantage because it's all dynamic. We don't think about simply industries, but we think about arenas in which these things happen now. It's no longer one industry. You can essentially be operating in numerous industries simultaneously or arenas at that point. We call these ecosystem economies. Very, very dynamic. And you notice everything that you see here becomes dotted. You begin to have anchors inside and outside, and we navigate around all these things. But it's extremely dynamic. Take those concepts and bring them into organizations. In organizations, you have now an organization as an enterprise. It becomes a large, if you will, dynamic macro enterprise or an ecosystem enterprise. An ecosystem enterprise is an enterprise organization that operates as an ecosystem internally within a broader external ecosystem. And all these navigations begin to happen and all these dynamics begin to manifest. You think about your teams and your communities. Basically now we become very specific on how we talk about these. These become micro enterprises versus macro enterprises. They begin to exhibit the dynamic nature that we're talking about and the reconfiguration nature that we talk about. And then individuals do as well. And these are very observable. And I want to give some very, very specific examples, but the key about this that I really want to emphasize is everything within this picture has a life cycle. We've taken ecosystem thinking, recognized those life cycles, and then also everything here not only has a life cycle, but has also what's called an eco cycle, how it interacts and connects and has congruence and within the larger configuration that it plays in. In saying all that, there's very keywords that really tie us back to agility in John Boyd's work. That's the roots of it. There's really keywords here that ties us to antifragility in Nassim Taleb's work, and then likewise Holling's work in resilience. For example, in resilience, ecocycles are called panarchy, and how these different things come into play. Adaptive cycles are the life cycles that I mentioned. Let's go ahead and really dive into a few key other examples that come into play. You may look at this and you say, Si, we talk about systems. What's the real distinction between systems and ecosystems? Very simply, when you think about systems or joining an organization, you think about subscribing to the values of that organization or that culture. Natural tension between your personal values, the organization's values, and really, if you will, the organization's values begin to take precedent over your values. That's very different in an ecosystem. In an ecosystem, there's much more balance. There isn't that, the tension remains, but essentially there is balance with a looser tension between the two. The organizations or ecosystems values, don't simply take superordinate precedent over the individuals. So there's a very different dynamic, as I just emphasized. When you think about those words that I'm using and ecosystems, this is more than platforms, this is more than networks and relationships, but it's that tension that we've been talking about. So let's take a few sort of very key examples. As I've worked with clients and what have you, I've worked with organizations that find themselves extremely optimized. And I've had numerous clients say, hey, we've got our operating model, we've got our business model, extremely optimal. We're very much ready to do what we need to do. We're saving costs, etc. Then they encounter some turbulence. And when they encounter that turbulence, if you will, they're unable to respond. Essentially, what's happened is they've moved too much toward the order side of the equation. They don't know how to respond. Their operating model can't adapt. Their business models can't adapt. They've become too rigid, if you will, very much on the order side, and they struggle. So then what we do is we begin to stress the organization, stress the teams, etc., in order to help them move toward the in-between. Begin to go ahead and loosen that rigidity and move toward the in-between, where they can become much more dynamic, much more fluid, achieve much more flexibility and flux within the environment, if you will. Take another example. I've had many organizations that reach out and say, Si, you know, we're entrepreneurial. We've got some great things that we're doing. However, we're unable to mature and grow. So as I begin to think about them, investors don't want to invest. They can't increase their customer base. Their employees, essentially, the turnover rates become very significant. They're too far on the disorder side of the house, basically. They've done everything, but they can't grow. So what we do now is we begin to apply stresses that really begin to move them from the disorder side of the house toward the in-between, toward the order, if you will, side of the house. Again, really honing on the in-between. So you think about that from a ecosystem enterprise. Those are some of the key things that we need to move toward the in-between. Those are two very sort of general examples of organizations that are either too entrepreneurial or essentially too rigid that have to move toward the in-between. Let me give a few more examples relative to teams, if you will. I've worked with organizations. I actually love this organization very much. They say, Si, we've got numerous teams in our organization here in our enterprise, and we have a big problem. Some teams run really hot during some times of the year. Other teams run very cold in that time of the year, and then basically people get tired, etc. And our business cycles and how we've got our teams don't operate very well, and we're not being very successful. And you know, we've got stable teams, etc. We've got consistent teams. So one of the suggestions I made to him very quickly is, okay, let's go ahead and help people essentially shift across teams. And they said, wait a minute, everything we read about says you should have stable teams. I said, well, let's go ahead and begin to allow people to shift and think about how essentially the teams organize themselves relative to the business cycle. As we began to do this, really helping people operate as more micro enterprises and begin to become much more fluid across teams, their velocity, their impact began to increase. Here in this case, very naturally, the system itself, if you will, the ecosystem and all the teams began to level how they operate. That was very, very crucial. They were very surprised. And they said, gosh, all the literature is telling us one thing. Again, the literature, I said, was approaching it, and the experiences were approaching it from a systems point of view, not an ecosystems point of view. Here's another organization that I encountered in working with their teams. They said, look, we've got our teams, they're operating, etc. Some teams seem to be doing better than other teams. There's always good, bad, and ugly. Some teams are really struggling and what have you. And as I observed some of these teams, I said, let's go ahead and implement one particular rule. And they said, what's that? And I said, let's give people the opportunity on teams to vote people off their teams or invite people on their teams. They said, well, how can we do that? And we worked with human resources. And then what began to happen now is, again, teams became much more dynamic as micro enterprises, focused on their goals and objectives, and now we're able to vote people off, invite people on, etc. That tension, that dynamic is another crucial aspect for injecting ecosystem thinking into teams. That's another very, very explicit example. And as you can hear through all these, this is the way that we inject ecosystem thinking across this whole space and move really from this picture to this picture. All these, I'm not saying you should adopt any of these practices. They're all very contextual, but the principles are really what you want to keep in mind and the concepts as we're applying them. Let me give a few more key examples relative to this picture before we move on. Worked with other organizations. They encountered, if you will, a lot of innovation. They were disrupted in their marketplace, and they said, what should we do? And I said, well, I'll tell you what, let's bring all the teams together. Let's begin to think about creating what I called a value marketplace, helping teams really in the organization begin to exchange capabilities, features of their products, services that they were providing, a marketplace of value. That marketplace allowed us, again, to move toward micro enterprises and really introduce ecosystem thinking. That really helped them begin to respond to all the extreme innovation they were encountering in the ecosystem economy that they were operating in and numerous arenas that they were involved with. Another one, and this ties very, very critically to most recent times, with the Great Resignation, Great Rethink, Great Recalibration, if you will. Another organization said to me, we don't have the skill sets. We can't get the skill sets. We're very challenged in terms of skill sets. I said, not to worry. Let's go ahead and create a skills marketplace, like a value marketplace, and begin to have these skills really begin to be exchanged within the environment amongst teams and what those contributors do as individuals with their skills. In the same vein, they began to be able to grow the communities around them, grow the skill sets, and really achieve a degree of strength that they hadn't encountered before by keeping sort of the skill sets locked in the different teams. So injecting, again, ecosystem thinking at teams and community level. Let me give just very quickly a few more examples before we move on, because this is very, very key as you kind of digest some of the thought process here. Notice I'm not suggesting particular practices, but rather truly the principles. Worked with a very, very large organization, if you will, very, very prominent organization. And essentially what I detected is the C-suite. Essentially, any time that the C-suite, from the CEO to the CFO, the COO to the CHRO, were threatened, they would remove people from their organization. What they were truly doing is killing variety in their environment. And they would keep people that were essentially more loyal, for lack of better words, rather than approaching their world from an ecological viewpoint, as we've been talking about. And as this continued, really the organization began to struggle and suffer as the market began to change and the different markets that they were involved in began to change. The organization couldn't respond anymore. Ultimately, that organization went out of business, if you will. It completely failed, and a very, very prominent organization. And the guidance that came out of that, don't think in terms of mere loyalty. That's very, very crucial. Think in terms of ecology. And when I talk about ecology, that is really the blend of what we're sharing here. Again, ecosystem thinking to achieve the facets of agility, resilience, and anti-fragility. Keep in mind, again, as I mentioned, this is not about technology platforms and networks and relationships. It's much, much more than that. And as we've been talking about a few of the examples that I've given here. Well, how do we make this real? How do we leverage this? Well, definitively, as I like to say, when I work with organizations and really help them transform, we transcend into an ecosystem. I won't get into much detail here, but I want to emphasize there's multiple cycles. It's a continuous evolution, as we've talked about, and changing the dynamics of the world around us and within ourselves. We energize, we experience things, we embody things, and we deal with reality. At the same time, at a more granular level, we enact and we embrace things that happen around us, and we really begin to have agility, resilience, and anti-fragility. Those muscles begin to improve over time. A lot more can be said on this slide. I'm gonna say very little, if you will, relative to this, because I definitely want to get into sort of I'll say the gift that comparative agility has offered me and has offered us. Is you take everything I'm talking about, it's in the books I've mentioned, but we've been able to do something with comparative agility that is extremely powerful. We've taken a lot of these things and codified them, if you will, into the Edge collection, a collection of capabilities that really begin to demystify these concepts. Again, more than simply leveraging the books, but leveraging, if you will, these capabilities brought forward and by comparative agility, and really beginning to reveal insights of how we can achieve and really catalyze or transform ourselves and become much more agile, much more anti-fragile, and much more resilient. Very, very crucial in those capabilities. And I'll mention the capabilities here more explicitly. The one thing I do want to mention is these capabilities are now available. I encourage folks to reach out to me and likewise to use them, reference them, but there's more to come. In particular, there's more to share that as we go on this journey. There's indexes, there's quotients around agility, resilience, and anti-fragility that we'll be making available, and really an edge even quotient and index, different radars, likewise, and maturity models that can be used. So a lot of tools for people to use in leveraging a lot of the things that I've mentioned to help them implement these principles and these concepts and derive the practices that will work for you. Just to summarize the Edge collection a little bit, there's an individual, if you will, personal improvement capability and assessment that can be used. There's one for teams, one for enterprises, and one for ecosystems. I highly encourage folks to take a look at them, whether they're focusing individually with their teams or as team leaders or enterprise leaders, as well as ecosystem leaders across the board. So a lot of the things I've mentioned, there's a lot of content and webinars that I've done otherwise that you can tap into. In this hour, I've tried to cover a lot of ground, missed a lot of detail naturally, as you can imagine, but truly we wanted to emphasize I'm very, very graciously appreciative of all the good things that comparative agility has moved forward in making these things available for individuals, teams, enterprises or enterprise ecosystems, and ecosystems or ecosystem economies at large. So with that, you have my contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out via email or connect on LinkedIn, whether you're thinking about leveraging these things, addressing questions, or how to leverage the insights that are provided with these tools.